Um, uh, Let me just quickly introduce him. Some of you maybe have already met him. His reputation does precede him. There's an expression that, in English that we like to save the best for last. But I always feel like life's too short, so I like to go to the best first. So Bruce, Dr. Newsome's our opening speaker for the semester. I really appreciate, Bruce, you stepping in with so little notice and with so much going on. Um, Dr. Newsome did his undergraduate work in London at King's College. He graduated with honors in war studies. He then did some of his early graduate work at University of Pennsylvania and Columbia, and then returned to the UK, where he completed his PhD at the University of Reading. He's worked all over the place. He spent several years at the RAND Corporation, a think tank, worked up at Cal Berkeley for a while. We were just kind of talking about that indirectly. Worked at UCSD, and most importantly, he's taught a few courses for us. We've been lucky to recruit him for our graduate program. He's now based at University of Texas. So again, thank you for staying overtime, Bruce. He's published basically all over the place. He's super versatile. He's written books on tanks, didn't work on terrorism, just published a couple of articles on the Ukraine that maybe I'll get the links to and forward to you. He's had a blog on Brexit for several years now, because it took about 4 years to complete that process. Anyway, really an extraordinary personality. We're really lucky to have him. It's a little bit ironic that he's going to be talking about the Ukraine, at least for part of his talk, because 2 years ago, spring 2020, Dr. Newsome and I were going to take a group of graduate students to Kiev for a NATO conference. It actually wasn't technically not NATO itself. It was something called the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. It was kind of like a NATO legislature. So maybe the analogy would be we weren't going to Europe to the Pentagon. We were going to Capitol Hill to meet with members of the House and Senate Armed Services Committee. Anyway, that got kicked down the road because of COVID. But Bruce, I don't know if you know, it's back in Kiev this spring. So I haven't confided in my students. They have said we would love to take a slightly early final exam on the last day of the semester. So if the Russians are not occupying Ukraine, Willoughby can go to that conference. Anyway, I've asked Dr. Newsome to talk for about whatever he wants to, 30, 40 minutes maybe, but to leave a little bit of time for Q&A. The discussion is always really an icing on the cake. Dr. Newsome, thank you so much. I turn it over to you.
Thank you, sir. So yeah, timing is everything. I miss that we never went to Ukraine, and then now you're able to go. I'm no longer in San Diego, so I missed that. So hello, everybody over there. Welcome from, or howdy from Texas. I'm always delighted to speak to Randy's, or Professor Willoughby's students, because I know how well he trains you, and we always get a good discussion. So I'm always happy to take the invitation to speak to you. So what I want to talk to you about is NATO's southern flank. So I'm just going to share my screen with you here, and I'll speak to it. If anybody has trouble seeing it, there might be a slight delay in it popping up at your end, but I'll assume you can see it unless you tell me otherwise. So what I want to talk about and leave time for questions is NATO's southern flank, and I'll explain what that geography is in a moment. Now, a lot of this is about Ukraine, and actually I should credit Professor Willoughby's other timing in that he managed weeks ago to schedule this talk on the day that Russia was supposed to invade Ukraine, according to the current administration. So all credit to Randy there. So this is very topical. We will look a lot at Ukraine. Southern flank is bigger than Ukraine, and actually the current crisis relates a lot to the neighborhood rather than just Ukraine. So yeah, so I've got a lot to say, but I'll try to do this in 30 minutes and leave plenty of time for questions. So let's look at the geography. So we may have some other lectures with me and you about NATO's other parts. Conventionally, we talk about the northern flank, which is really the Arctic, from the Atlantic Ocean into the Arctic Ocean, so that Scandinavia, that is the leftmost, northernmost flank of NATO. So that's the northern flank. And then there's the Baltic area, which is a secondary front between NATO and Russia. So there's a NATO front with Russia in Norway and through Sweden and Finland, in the sense that they are partners of NATO, they're not members of NATO. And then NATO has another front in the Baltics, because the Baltic states are all members of NATO. And then the center, which used to be Germany used to be the key front with the old Soviet Union and then the emergent Russia. And that central part is not particularly salient anymore. And so far as it is, it relates to the southern flank. The southern flank is really big, as NATO conventionally thinks about it, because Ukraine is a big country, and because Belarus, which is north of Ukraine, because Belarus is sort of a highly aligned state with Russia, and a lot of Russia's threats against Ukraine are postured inside Belarus. Now you've got the southern flank extending all the way up to Belarus, which is on the border with the Baltic states and with Poland. So the southern flank has become much more important. It's become much bigger because of the changing dynamics between Russia and Ukraine. So you may read some disputes about what the southern flank is, but really, as it's currently being exercised, it's from Belarus through Ukraine, all the way down through Turkey, and all of those borders with Russia. And then it's the neighbors of Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, and certainly Poland. And Poland is sort of central to Northern Europe. So, you get the idea. I don't want to belabor the point, but this southern flank is sort of kind of the neglected flank, the undervalued flank, because it's so huge and it's salient now, but it gets neglected because people think about NATO as being all about German security, and that has not been true since the Cold War. All right, so this is the southernmost end of that flank. So these countries in this map, these are the unambiguous countries at issue when we talk about NATO's southern flank. And some of these are full members, like Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Turkey. Those are full members of NATO. And then you've got partners of NATO, Ukraine and Georgia, and they are on a potential path to full membership. And this path to membership is the leading dispute that Putin has chosen to focus on this year. So his threats against Ukraine, actually starting last year, not just this year, but starting last year, there's several items on his list of demands, but the key one is that Ukraine must not be a member of NATO. And he has some arguments behind that, which I think are false and knowingly false, such as he says that NATO is an aggressive alliance, and that if Ukraine was a member, that would threaten Russia. I think that's false. That's more viable to talk about whether Ukraine is ready for NATO membership, whether Russian minority would be honored by a more Western-oriented Ukraine. That's where Russia's disputes with NATO become more legitimate. But even there, I'm not. I don't take them particularly plausibly. I'm not sure that's the right word, but I don't. Those sort of arguments from Putin don't hold much wash with me. So to be upfront, in my opinion, my estimate of Putin, I think he is making excuses for in order to expand Russia, because, as other political scientists have documented, Putin, is very mindful that Russia's long-term geopolitical prospects are weak. It has a declining population. It relies heavily on energy exports for its foreign currency, and its energy reserves will decline. And therefore, he has this short-term incentive to snatch as much power as he can, material power, old-fashioned territory. And therefore, he's using NATO's expansion as an excuse, as a pretext for snatching territory. And I realize that gets a lot of pushback, and I've published articles this week where you can read in the comments. There's lots of trolling probably from Russia itself, where people consider that sort of view as warmongering and anti-Russian. But that's my estimate, and I'll be upfront. We can talk about that later. So Black Sea, I should mention, is at the center of this southern flank, and that has implications a lot of people don't realize, such as naval ships operating in the Black Sea. They become platforms for the extension of military capabilities, both into the Middle East and into Central Europe. So control of the Black Sea isn't just about bragging rights or even about trade into the Black Sea. It has military consequences. So if one state can dominate the Black Sea, they have a platform, a military platform for operations further afield. And also, obviously, Black Sea is somewhere where you can pool your naval assets and then very quickly get into the Mediterranean, at least if you're not at war with Turkey, because Turkey has the right to close the straits in the event of war. So then, you've got this quick naval potential to quick deployment into the Mediterranean Sea, and then that affects Middle Eastern security, Southern European security, and then ultimately Atlantic security too. So this is where we focus on Ukraine. It's just a bit of history to ground what's happening right now since 2020, particularly. So we've already had a war in Ukraine. I mean, Russia has already invaded Ukraine. And so it kind of annoys me when I see on the television news, particularly politicians sometimes say, we don't want another war in Europe. We haven't had a land war in Europe since World War II. And that's not true. I mean, Russia has invaded Georgia in 2008 and invaded Ukraine in 2014. The ambiguity about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you can actually see trolls. They'll write that it's a myth that Russia never invaded Ukraine. Again, this is something I'm not persuaded by. Russia practiced this now famous hybrid war, where it sent Russian troops in pretending to be local volunteers, right? But so as in the Russian-speaking, culturally Russian residents of Ukraine, who mostly reside in the eastern part of Ukraine, they just spontaneously rose up and seized forces. And Russia, so far as Russia was involved, they were keeping the peace. No, this was an invasion. It was an aggressive war, and that's how it should be coded. Now, the upshot of that 2014 invasion was that Russia took Crimea, which they wanted for the naval bases. Crimea does have some agricultural value, but it really has no other value apart from naval bases. And Russia also took these eastern provinces, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kharkiv, and it stopped short of that. And that affects Putin's estimates of Putin's mindset today, because some people argue that Putin learned the lesson that hybrid warfare actually doesn't work. Because if you're going to maintain the myth that you're not invading a country, that you're just keeping the peace around and about local volunteers, then you can't go all the way to Kiev. You can't take the whole of Crimea, because then that's obviously an invasion. So you end up, Putin ends up in 2014 with Russian control over various provinces, some of them really valuable like Crimea. But under this argument, his lesson is hybrid warfare doesn't allow you to snatch the whole country. And it may be that his build-up on Ukraine's the wider Ukrainian borders since last year is actually him trying to snatch the whole of Ukraine in a conventional way, because the hybrid warfare didn't get him everything that he wanted in 2014. So that's one argument to be aware of. All right, so Ukraine for itself, it is in its own policy and actually in its own law, it is on a path to become a NATO member. Currently, it is a NATO partner, and that has been going on since 1991. So almost as soon as, actually within months of it formally renouncing any links with Russia and being a sovereign country, it joined the North Atlantic Cooperation Council, which was the initial NATO institution for peace building with the former republics of the Soviet Union. Then it joined Partnership for Peace, which is a formal partnership. That's where it formally starts on a potential process towards full membership. The barriers to membership still are domestic corruption and lack of civilian control over the military. So not lack of formal civilian control over the military, but lack of reassurance that the civilian government has all the control that it claims constitutionally. So it's a de facto, it's worries about de facto control, not de jure control. By 2016, because of the 2014 invasion of Ukraine, NATO had a summit where it voted a comprehensive assistance package, which is partly material. So there's material aid, but it's a lot about training and enhancing interoperability. So having exercises where the different multinational forces actually exercise with Ukrainian forces, including in the Black Sea, including on Ukrainian territory. So it's been true for a number of years that there have been NATO missions inside Ukraine. And it's those missions which are essentially training, assistance, capacity building missions. It's those missions to which Putin refers to when he claims that NATO is secretly occupying Ukraine. 2017, Ukraine's objective became law. In 2020, so 2020 on schedule, this was not accelerated by anything, least of all COVID. The North Atlantic Council, which has unanimous votes, remember, it recognized Ukraine as an enhanced opportunities partner, which means that that NATO is happy with the progress Ukraine is making, and NATO is going to invest more in things like interoperability and explicitly NATO is recognizing that Ukraine is further along the path to membership. Doesn't guarantee membership, but it's further along. So Ukraine is a partner, it's not a member. There are, as I noted, 4 close neighbors who are full members of NATO. So Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey. So Greece is almost sharing a border on the Black Sea. Practically, from my perspective, practically Greece is a Black Sea power because it has a very strong navy. And it operates very strongly in the Adriatic and into the Black Sea because of competition with Turkey. So even though Greece and Turkey are both members, they compete, as you know, they have historical antagonisms. So they compete for oil exploration rights in these seas, for instance. Now, Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey, they've all received NATO forces explicitly to balance against Russia. And this started when Russia invaded Georgia, parts of Georgia in 2008, and accelerated when Russia moved into Ukraine in 2014. So I just want to note pledges that were made at that the second NATO summit in 2016. So various NATO members pledged to permanently rotate aircraft and/or warships in these neighbors. So we often think about Germany as the NATO member that has permanent bases for military forces from other NATO members, but in fact now it's all the Baltic states, it's Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey. They all have foreign member country forces permanently rotating through these countries. Romania and Bulgaria tend to get a lot of aircraft assets because their air defenses are weak. And then Ukraine is getting a lot of naval assets currently. Now, these create diplomatic tensions at least. And you can imagine the risks of war, the increased risks of war are that if, planes collide or they're accidentally shot down. So a Russian plane was shot down over Turkey because when it was operating in Syria, the Russian pilots got in the habit of cutting across a bit of territory which stuck into Syria, and it was quicker for them to cross that. And Turkey one time decided they were going to shoot down a plane. They weren't happy with this. And Turkey did it deliberately, and then Russia complained, and then Turkey said it was a mistake. And Turkey has some ambiguous relations with Russia. Like it does buy military equipment from Russia. It does side with Russia on certain issues, particularly in Syria. But at the same time, it's still a NATO member, and it will also have allegiances to other NATO members. Right, so Black Sea area. All right, let's move on to what started happening last year. So Russia's latest buildup on the border actually dates from April of last year. So it's been going on for about 10 months. It was noted it's probably started in March of 2021, but the United States government actually made an issue of it, started releasing satellite imagery in April 2021. In that month, so later in that same month, Putin delivered his annual State of the Union, and he links this buildup to threats, right? He's saying that he's responding to threats, that these are defensive build-ups on Ukraine's border because NATO has secret plans to rush Ukraine into NATO membership and to base a whole lot of forces, foreign forces in Ukraine aimed at Russia. Now, I'm just going to show this interesting article from a British magazine, The Spectator, because it illustrates that word was getting out in April 2021 that Western governments, and led by Britain, this is going to become a theme. So Britain has been leading concerns about Russian activities in Eastern Europe in general, but in Ukraine in particular. And it's the United States that has tended to be on the back foot in its response to Ukraine, Russia in Ukraine. But even though rhetorically Britain expresses the most concern, Britain still has to follow what the US does, because Britain cannot defend Ukraine on its own, or it cannot make viable guarantees for Ukraine without NATO unanimity, which is led by the US. So for what it's worth, Britain was making these noises that if you don't guarantee Ukraine, there are wider global problems with that, such as empowering China. So Britain was ahead in making these points. And, American politics is, we can discuss this later in detail if you want. I'll just put the idea out there. American politics is very divided at the moment about who the bad guys are, or who the priorities are And I've gone on record in criticizing certain politicians like Josh Hawley, who a Republican, who says, you know, forget Russia. We have to focus on China. We can't. If you worry about what Russia's doing, we're not left with any capacity to deal with China. And I think that's wrong. If you appease Russia, you empower China. And the United States has got to have the ambition and the self-interest in meeting aggression wherever it is. Anyway, the other point of that slide was that Britain has been really leading on the global risks of appeasing Russia in Ukraine. Right, quick note on Belarus, because often the commentary about what's happening in Ukraine is focused on Ukraine's borders, Russia's borders with Ukraine. But Russia, what's different about its build-up in 2020 versus 2014 is that Russia is building up everywhere around Ukraine, including in the Black Sea, and even in Moldova, which is between Romania and Ukraine. So it's gathering these forces that surround Ukraine to give it all these options to invade anywhere it likes, almost anywhere it likes, and to appear to be able to occupy the whole country. And that's different to 2014, where it restricted its forces to that southeastern corner. Its ambitions were clearly less in 2014 than they are in 2021. Belarus is very aligned with Russia, has a very antagonistic relationship with the European Union, which was epitomized in 2021 when it was facilitating migrants into the European Union, mostly into Poland. And it was flying migrants, freely flying them into Western neighbors, with allegedly the intent to destabilize EU and NATO members. Right, so 2021 was already a, what's the right word? It was already an antagonistic year between Belarus in the West and Russia in the West. But then it gets worse in November 2021. So November of last year, it gets worse. So it was in that month that the US government first announces that there are now Putin has breached 100,000 troops on Ukraine's border. And these were only on Russia's border with Ukraine. They're actually more than that. They're about 20,000 in Belarus, which then belatedly get counted with 100,000, which is when belatedly people started talking about there's actually 120,000 troops on the border with Ukraine. And Putin made explicit in that month, he wants NATO to withdraw from Eastern Europe in general, where he means Poland and the Baltic states. There's already forces rotating, like brigade groups already rotating through there since 2016. And the next demand was no admission of Ukraine. And it's that second demand that then later becomes the primary demand, right? So back in November, his primary demand was NATO withdraw from Eastern Europe. Well, clearly that's not going to happen. So then his primary demand was Ukraine must not be a member of NATO. NATO's Secretary General treated this at the time as a diplomatic dispute. Nobody's really taking seriously at that time the possibility of Russian invasion. And it's been my opinion that Putin did not set out to invade Ukraine, but he's an opportunist. And when he's appeased and when the West seems confused, he's emboldened to consider, yeah, maybe he should invade. Right, there's some curious things about November of that year, which I just want to note. So the Biden administration sent its two most senior intelligence officials to essentially practice diplomacy. And this is very unconventional, and I still haven't read a good explanation for this. So the Director of Central Intelligence went to Moscow. And the most likely explanation I can think of is that Biden decided that you needed the Director of the Central Intelligence to go to Moscow and say, this is how good our intelligence is. You will never escape our accusations about what you're doing. But the downside of that is you're revealing your intelligence. And as I've written this week, the other downside is that you're desensitizing the public to the risks of Russian invasion, because you're saying, look at all these forces. Putin can do it, and he's intent on doing it. So when it happens, people are going to be less shocked. But if you think about that from Putin's perspective, invading becomes less risky. The more you desensitize people to the possibility of invasion, the less risky it becomes for Putin. And then perversely, you're actually increasing the risk or the chance of him invading. Now, officially back in November, the US government was saying it estimates, so its intelligence estimates that Putin is still uncertain about invading Ukraine. And I think that is probably true. Putin is, as an opportunist, which is the way I've always thought of him. You know, he puts forces on the border, he makes demands, and he just sees what's going to happen. He's not intent on invading. But as I've just argued, you know, if you desensitize the chance of desensitize the public to the possibility of invading, you actually make Putin feel emboldened to invade. Now, the reason people felt more secure after November, because November, if you recall, was a pretty, like this month, it was a pretty hectic month for news reporting about the risk in Ukraine. The reason people calmed down was the weather. It wasn't any changes in the deployment. It's because there was unusually warm weather from November in that region, from November into this month, February. And the ground was not frozen enough to consider a winter invasion. So what the West, so 2022 or 2021 to 2022 is a bit like 2014. The West is slow to react, and it's confused, and it doesn't make unambiguous policy positions about what's going to happen. You only get to January 2022 when the West strategy starts to align. So you've got a sort of coherent Western strategy. And there's three parts to this as I read it. The West, led by the US, says, if you invade, you're going to get more economic sanctions. The problem with this has been articulated by many other people before me, is that the threat only kicks in after you invade. So you don't say, you know, Putin is already acting like a malicious actor. He's already, you know, he's destabilizing economies. He's frightening foreign direct investment out of Ukraine. He's already causing Ukraine and then the West cost. The West is deploying forces. You know, the stock markets fall, price of oil goes up. So Putin is not suffering these costs because his economy is somewhat insulated from all of these things. All right, second part of the strategy was more military aid to Ukraine. That is very belated, and there's some doubt whether Ukrainian personnel can get trained quickly enough in these new technologies like Javelin anti-tank missiles. The third part of the strategy is reinforce some neighboring NATO members, particularly Poland. But nobody in the West has guaranteed Ukraine's sovereignty. Nobody has guaranteed that they would come to Ukraine's defense. And Biden spoke just yesterday, and he was very careful to say, the US reaffirms our commitment to defend NATO members. Well, Ukraine is not a NATO member. So the West has not really raised the costs for Putin. In fact, has clarified that the costs are not any greater than they were in 2014. You know, a bit of ambiguity sometimes is good because it creates a bigger band of risk for the other side. All right, this is what the situation looked like at the end of January. I'm going to skip over that. Right, so there's some military aid we can talk about later. the focus from the US and Britain has been anti-tank missiles. Javelin is longer range, but the British won the updated light anti-tank weapon missile. That's handier, lighter, easier to deploy in urban areas where the Ukrainian forces are likelier to try to focus their defensive activities. Various countries have promised fighters to neighboring states, although not all of them have deployed yet. Notably, Germany refused lethal aid. It sent helmets eventually. And then you get to February this month. So there's been, again, belatedly, why didn't this happen in January or even in November or even in April? Belatedly, it's only the first couple of weeks of February that NATO actually moved some forces around, some actual troops, boots on the ground, rather than promises of fighter planes and warships. So a few troops were moved from Britain, the homeland, to Poland. Britain's Eastern European military focus is Estonia, by the way. It leads the NATO deployments in Estonia, not Poland. The US leads in Poland, but Britain has sent some more troops to Poland. After that, the US sent paratroopers to Poland, and then, you know, again, epitomizing this sort of drip of Western policy, the US sends 1,700, and then a few days later it says, well, we'll send another 3,000, which is more significant. But why not realize that's how many you send in the first place? And some a part of the Striker Brigade in Germany has been moved to Romania. Strikers are those light 8-wheeled vehicles at the bottom of the picture there. All right, so let me try to finish off here on this slide in the interest of time. Yeah, this is where we circle back to Britain. So I've got criticisms of British policy too, and Britain, as you probably know, the British government is mired in its own scandals, such as holding parties in Number 10 during lockdown, contrary to laws that Number 10 itself had tabled. But Britain, what's consistent about British policy is it is explicit that Russia needs to be contained, that we should not appease Russia's threat. When Russia keeps making these threats, we should not make concessions, because Putin is able to keep chipping away at territory and economic concessions and diplomatic climb downs, such as Biden has several times before yesterday signaled that he doesn't care that much about Ukraine's membership of NATO. So some examples of British resolution here. So the British Foreign Secretary went to Moscow. She was rebuffed. She was actually rudely treated by her Russian counterpart, but at least she went, and that contrasts with the US administration, which has not sent equivalent level of missions so recently. But Britain is a follower, so it has to warn its citizens to leave once the US does. So it's not true that Britain has left forces in Ukraine in harm's way, but would you expect it to? Now, the final quote I have from you is from Ben Wallace, bottom right corner. He's the Defense Secretary, and he's always been robust on expressing his desire for a more robust policy towards Russia. And there's a very interesting quote that he gave the press voluntarily. He wasn't leaked or misquoted or he wasn't captured saying this when he thought he was off the record. He said, "There's a whiff of Munich in the air," referring to Neville Chamberlain's appeasement of Germany in 1938. And the only ambiguity is which country he really means here. Is it the two candidates of the US and Germany for whom he means? So he's diplomatic enough not to specify whom in the West, is an appeaser, but he's saying the West is slipping into appeasement. And that's where the Western policy confusion remains, right? There's less confusion about the military responses and the sanctions and all that, but there's still this confusion about how far are we going to appease versus how far are we going to contain. And with that, I'm going to finish my slides and invite questions from you.
Bruce, thank you so much. Another tour de force of the southern flank. I'm going to go ahead and invite the students to take the lead in asking questions. If you guys don't mind, just raise your hand, and I'll call on you, and we go from there. I need to see who's raising their hand. Chase, why don't you go first, and then Sophie.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Newsome. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you bet.
All right, so my question is, currently it seems rather land-based with a lot of land forces involved. What are we doing to support the maritime security of the Black Sea? Because it seems that NATO member nations would have more of a stake involved in the Black Sea due to the access that it provides Russia to project power in other nations because of that.
You're right. So I had a couple of slides on the Black Sea. I'll just note them here. We're recording this, so I get the slides up, and then if you watch the video, you can pause on them further. So yeah, there have been reinforcements in the Black Sea, and you're right that the naval reinforcements get little attention in the news, and that's because people are very focused on boots on the ground. But as it happens, some countries, particularly Britain, are much more involved in building Ukraine's naval capacity than its ground capacity. So Britain voluntarily has been leading NATO's training missions. So in a similar way that Britain leads missions to Estonia, it leads the naval missions, NATO's naval missions in the Black Sea. It is the primary trainer of Ukraine naval personnel, and it leads these annual naval exercises, which are intended to build interoperability between NATO and Ukraine. And I'll just show you this slide too, which you can pause in the video later. Ukraine has very little capacity. Since the loss of Crimea, it has very little capacity to prevent a Russian amphibious landing in Ukraine. Now, there are reasons why Russia would not want to launch amphibious landings, and that's because the parts of the Ukrainian territory which are closest to Kiev and are not, they don't have good beaches, and there's still open areas which would be easy for Russia's adversaries to bombard and things like that. So an amphibious invasion is not necessarily in Russia's interest, but Ukraine, in a material sense, has very little capacity to defend against it. So although this hasn't been well reported, NATO members such as the Netherlands and Britain have some serious skin in the game in the Black Sea. I mean, they've got warships that are in line of fire, and they've spent many years rotating ships into the Black Sea to build interoperability with the Ukraine. So in many senses, some NATO members, such as Britain, they're taking more risks in the Black Sea, on the surface of the Black Sea, than they are in Ukraine itself, because particularly as of last week, because as I noted, Britain, the US ordered their military personnel, all their diplomatic military personnel, to leave Ukraine. However, they can still say that those military personnel can still stay afloat on the surface of the Black Sea, because that does not count as Ukrainian territory.
Hey, before I go to Sophie, Bruce, do you mind if I just follow up? I would think that several of us are wondering, shouldn't Turkey have an awful lot at stake in the Black Sea? And, so is their Navy so busy, beating up the Greeks, or, trying to make a connection with Libya, that they don't have time to deploy in their backyard. You could even make a comment more generally about, can NATO count on Turkey in the hypothetical event of war to do things like squeeze, the Bosporus and make that Russian capability to move from the Black Sea into the Med more problematic?
It's a great question, and I wish I knew more about the answer to that. I'm more confident about the capabilities than the intent. I don't see that Turkey has a self-interest in betraying NATO in favor of Russia on such a major issue as this. However, meaning Ukraine sovereignty. However, Turkey has certainly betrayed NATO's interests in favor of Russia on other issues, as I mentioned, particularly Syria. So Turkey was not aligned with the West on Syria, was actually acting independently on the ground in Syria, contrary to other Western wishes. Now, as for its capabilities, it is true that Turkey has not pledged any naval forces to support Ukraine, which is a bit odd because Turkey is Ukraine's nearest friendly naval power. And I think that is more of a sign of Turkey's material foci on Greece and Syria than it is any sort of diplomatic position. It doesn't reflect a diplomatic position in favor of Russia. I just think it's a consequence of its material obligations elsewhere.
Thank you. Sophie, please. And if anyone else has a question, please go ahead and raise your hand. Thank you.
I'm not really sure how to phrase my question, so bear with me. But I'm pretty sure Ukraine is like really divided as a country. Like the eastern and southern parts are very ethnically Russian and have a lot of like political ties to Russia. And that's the area that he's already kind of invaded and has a lot of influence in. So why would he want to take Western Ukraine and Kiev when he could just stop at the part that he already has a lot of control in?
Right. So your what do we call it? To confirm your understanding of the de facto status. The de facto status is that Russia controls those southeastern provinces and Crimea on the south coast. So that's de facto, but nobody else has, apart from Belarus, has recognized that de facto control as de jure. So Ukraine and all the other Western European countries treat Ukraine's sovereign borders as where they were before the 2014 invasion. But no, Ukraine's never going to get those back from Russia. So it's de facto control. That's the way it's going to stay. Now, as I was trying to explain earlier, one of the arguments to explain why Putin would be interested in the rest of Ukraine is his prior belief that Russia needs to expand and snatch as many valuable material resources as it can before its demographic problems and its fossil fuel problems kick in. And then, so that preceded 2014 and even preceded the 2008 invasion of Georgia. And then there's an additional explanation, which is what he learned in 2014 was that the West was weak enough and slow enough to respond. And hybrid warfare is too limiting, self-limiting a strategy, that what he should have done in 2014 is keep going, take Kiev, take the whole of Ukraine and present the West with a fait accompli and say, what are you going to do now? You're going to invade Ukraine and kick me out? You're going to threaten me with nuclear war? No. So he believes he should have had Ukraine. If he'd been bolder, he could have had Ukraine in 2014. And he's trying to make that up now, right? Doesn't mean that he's like I said, he's an opportunist. I don't think he's intent on occupying the rest of Ukraine. I just think he's an opportunist. So he thinks, if he thinks the West is weak enough, he'll snatch something. And a lot of people have made the point, how does he climb down from this? He's got to snatch something. I mean, even if it's just another small province, he's got to come away with something before he pulls those troops back from the border.
Bruce, we have an ice cream shop called 31 Flavors here, and I know NATO only has 30 members, but if the British are taking the lead, but we've already talked about maybe Turkey being problematic NATO member, maybe not on the big issues right now, but in some other significant ones. We got like Orban coming back from meeting with Putin saying, I don't see a problem. And we got the Germans, really equivocating on Nord Stream. Can you give us, I think Biden said something like, I think NATO is as united as they've ever been. What does that mean? NATO is as thick as it's ever been. Does that mean we really do have 30 flavors of opinion on Ukraine, and NATO is really as ununified as it is unified in terms of its potential response? I mean, if anything, Putin can already check, I've succeeded, mission accomplished in further dividing NATO.
Yeah, you put it very well. So I think the short answer is, no, there's no way NATO could be as united as it was during the Cold War. How could it possibly be as united as it was then? Because there was just such a clear threat. I mean, it was founded to confront this threat. The threat still existed during the Cold War. It was the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union has broken up, and you've still got Russia, which is making similar threats, but Russia is not as big as the Soviet Union, and it's not as its borders are not as westwards as the Soviet Union. So just that historical fact means that NATO cannot possibly be as united. And then NATO has found other roles for itself, whose objectives also cannot be as unifying as confronting the Soviet Union, such as building security in the Middle East. NATO has lots of out-of-area training missions and capacity building missions, and they are virtuous. There's nothing wrong with them, but they can't be as unifying. Now, so those are the sort of context that precedes this specific issue. Now, this issue, Russia's interests in Ukraine and Ukraine's interests in NATO, they might have been more unifying a decade ago, but things have changed for a lot of these members, particularly Germany, which is more dependent on Russian fossil fuels than it used to be. The general dissatisfaction with Western adventurism in the 2000s, particularly, has limited public faith in government intelligence. You're seeing this with Biden's claims to intelligence on Russia. There's less public faith in official intelligence. This is not just true for the US alone. This is true for all the Western governments. So the West just has these democratic, domestic limitations on its ability to unite as a Western bloc, because it has so many internal disputes and such a collapse of faith in government, both government capacity and government legitimacy. And when I say government capacity, there are public doubts that the West can get anything done. That the West should not or cannot lead anymore.
Uh, Grace, actually, I heard a rumor, Grace, that you were in Paris, Madrid, and Moscow over Thanksgiving.
I was, yeah, in Paris and Madrid.
Okay, there wasn't a secret mission. Okay, please your question, please.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Newsome. I just had like a two-part question, but I was wondering how the addition of Ukraine into NATO would affect current tensions with Russia and NATO itself, and what's preventing Ukraine from joining NATO currently.
Well, officially, it has not met NATO's targets for lowering corruption and demonstrating civilian control. There are then the military capacity concerns, which are not formally parts of NATO's assessment of whether Ukraine is ready. So NATO formally requires a new member to be diplomatically and governmentally ready. Its military capacity can follow. However, it does have a factor in how people think informally about whether Ukraine is ready. So if Ukraine's interoperability was further along, that would help. But I think the opposition in NATO countries to the gathering opposition, well, opposition isn't actually the right word. It's the discomfort or doubts about whether Ukraine ever should be a member. That is driven almost entirely by Russian threats, not by Ukraine's opportunities. Because people are war shy, and they're very mindful of economic instability after COVID and longer economic cycles. So the West is just, it doesn't seem willing to risk war to defend Ukraine. That's the bottom line.
We have time for one or two more questions, Catherine.
I'm wondering what economic sanctions would look like, especially if Russia has leverage with fossil fuels, how effective those would be.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll give you my personal assessment is Putin. I don't think Putin's particularly worried about economic sanctions. So that may be the wrong way to put it. What I'm confident in saying is Putin is less worried about economic sanctions in 2022 than he was in 2014. And the reason for that is that he has deliberately tried to insulate the Russian economy from any further sanctions. So his regime and his elite circle have repatriated or onshored their financial assets back to Russia or into other countries that they feel aligned with, like China. And then Russia has signed various economic privileges with China, trading privileges. It's got military cooperation agreements now, such as military cooperation in the Arctic Circle, which could help it replace trade routes that the West might cut off. China is a legitimate market for fossil fuels if the West really cuts itself off from Russian fossil fuels, which I don't think the West will do. So economic sanctions are less risky than they were for Putin. Now, having said that, he will certainly suffer costs from economic sanctions. And these costs may be domestic political costs where, so far as oligarchs are still on his side and still living abroad, they could be really hurt. And, then they express then they take support away from Putin. But, I don't think the threat of economic sanctions guarantees a peaceful Putin. Let me put it like that.
Alexander, please.
Thank you, Dr. Newsome. I just wanted to clarify, you said that if you appease Russia, you also empower China as well to take similar actions against Taiwan. If Russia were to invade Ukraine, do you think it's very likely that China will similarly invade Taiwan? And how would the U.S. respond differently to China than Russia?
Well, yeah. So you've asked me a couple of questions there. So yes, I think China will become more adventurous if it sees Russia succeeding in Ukraine. Now, the chances of the US becoming more proactive in how it contains China are a bit conflicted, because you would expect the US government to learn from its failure in Ukraine. Actually, it's its second failure, right? 2014 was the first failure, to deter Russian aggression in Ukraine. So the second failure, you'd think this would be sort of the Rhineland moment, or the invasion, Hitler's invasion of Prague moment, where US government in this case realizes that it has to contain an unsatisfiable threat. You cannot satisfy this threat. So certainly diplomacy would become more robust, but materially the US might not have any capacity left to contain China, because then the corollary to having a more robust diplomatic strategy towards Russia is that you're investing your military resources in containing Russia to back up the diplomatic commitments you're making. So then the US and the West generally has fewer assets to contain China. So, what do you do next? What do you do then? I mean, then you fall back on the nuclear guarantee, I suppose. The US would have to extend a commitment to defend Taiwan with nuclear. All means necessary would be the phrase. All means necessary. It would defend Taiwan, which the US, that's a commitment the US has been ambiguous about. The Biden administration has been ambiguous about whether it would defend Taiwan.
Bruce, I think Macron met Putin and had like a 5-hour conversation, which Putin referred to as torture. They were social distancing on that big table. We've actually got a French student well, she's actually, I think, from Versailles, not Paris. So she's a bit of a royalist. But all I want to say is that my students will say, your 80-minute lectures are more torture than Macron's 5-hour conversations. And so your lecture has been so great. It's been so fantastic. It's going to be an impossible act for me to follow. So I don't know whether I can really thank you for such a great talk today, but I will let you go. It is now 5 o'clock Texas time. Take advantage of that liquid petroleum reputation to have a liquid.
Yeah.
And maybe everyone can express their appreciation to you. And
well, thank you, Randy. Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to talk to you. Great questions. That makes my day, right? When I get great questions, that's why I do it. So thank you, everybody. Good luck to you. Good luck, Randy.
Thank you, Dr. Newsome. Thank you, Dr. Whitby.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Dr. Newsome.
Thank you.